great. Thank you, Skip, and so good to see so many familiar faces here, and plus Peter's mom's watching in Naperville, Illinois, so we're making some folks happy there. We've got this is going to be very conversational up here, and then of course it'll be very conversational with y'all. But we've kind of got three parts that we want to talk about. First off, we want to talk about the reason we're here at the first place, which is a little battle over a precinct in Faulkner County, and we'll tell that story. Then we want to talk a little bit about what we know, both from the research that's been done, but also the lived experience of why this matters, why having a precinct on campus, a voting site on campus, why it does matter in terms of turnout of students. And then finally, we want to talk about some bigger normative questions and issues about why we should care about getting students engaged in this way at all. And so that's our plan. We both got a little bit to say about each of those things. The way this thing started, I, in my role as Director of Civic Engagement Projects at Hendrix, one of my responsibilities is to basically see that the voting process for students is humming along. And that's meant different things at different points in time. There was a period of time where we did not have a voting site on campus, and so it was a lot of time getting vans to run to early vote sites and all that. But about 10 years ago, the folks in Faulkner County provided an on-campus voting site, and it was easily done. They were great to work with. The combination of the election commission, the professional staff member on elections, and then the county clerk, they were all great to work with. We got this site up and running, and it had been going for about 5 election cycles. And a few months before an election, I would call, I would say, we're good to go, are you still happy with this room? How many student workers do we need? Just kind of to get things going. And so just before Thanksgiving last year, I called and sent an email actually to those folks, and I suddenly realized something was a little different this time because I started having some conversations, and the indication was, well, we think maybe it's time to shut down that precinct. And so, but they said, we've got an election commission meeting next Tuesday and nothing's final till then. So I started having some phone conversations and realizing that it was time to activate folks. And so I reached out to Jim Wilchin, who's the Dean of Students and a great advocate of civic engagement at Hendrix, and I reached out to Peter Butler, who was, of course, as Skip described, a student leader, but somebody since he arrived at Hendrix who has dedicated a lot of hours to this issue of student access to voting and student registration. And so I said, Peter, something's happening. We've got to figure out a way to get students engaged on this issue. The downside was, I believe we talked on the Tuesday night or the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, which means it's deadness on a college campus, and we had an election commission meeting the following Tuesday. And so I'll let Peter kind of take it from here.
Well, thank you, Dr. Barth, and thank you, Skip, for having us today. So as Dr. Barth was saying, I found this out after I'd already driven back to Illinois, and I was sitting in my room thinking about Thanksgiving. And the first thing that I thought was, I have about 4 nights to convince people on the day we're coming back from our break to then go off campus and go to a meeting which they've never heard of. And so I spent a good chunk of my Thanksgiving break actually sending text messages, emails, making a Facebook invitation, really trying to convince students that this matters. And back in 2014, we had seen an increase in the amount of students who had actually voted on campus compared to 2010 and 2012. And so I knew that there was a different environment going into Hendrix, which maybe previously had been waning a little bit. And what we were really trying to do was to show this election commission that we cared about our precinct. And so going into the meeting, Dr. Barth had explained to me that there used to be 26 polling sites across all of Faulkner County. They had talked about how they were going to go from, instead of having an assigned precinct, you would actually be eligible to vote in any precinct in the entire county so long as you were registered in Faulkner County. Not a bad idea. And one of the things that Dr. Barth and I were speculating about was that we were anticipating the overall precincts to go from 26 to maybe 10 or 15 really large locations throughout the county, and we were basically going to make our case to suggest a college campus is an integral part of the community. When we actually arrived at the meeting, and there was about myself, Dr. Barth, Jim Wilchin, and probably about 20 to 25 other students, we suddenly were a little more uncomfortable with the proposal. Instead of the proposal going from 26 to maybe 15 or 10, it was going from 26 to 24. They were cutting only 2 precincts, and it was Hendrix College and the University of Central Arkansas. Suddenly, it didn't feel like this was a cost-saving measure. It suddenly felt a lot more personal. And so as we were trying to understand from the Election Commission prior to the meeting starting what was going on, they had suggested that instead of actually having a precinct available on Election Day, they would allow us, being the college, to determine one day where they would set up a polling precinct during the early voting period. And the reasoning why is that they argued that they needed volunteers on Election Day to work the polls. They said that if you had these 2 additional locations, they would be spaces which weren't really used much by the students, from their argument, and that they could then take those volunteers elsewhere. The concern that we had when we heard this was that for the entire time that Hendrix and UCA have had precincts, students have been the ones working those polls. And a large reason for that is that it's really easy to get to. You can wake up in the morning, you go over, and then you just work the day. Sometimes we would actually have multiple students work shifts so that they could still attend their classes. And so the argument that they were going to be able to take these workers and export them to other parts of the county wasn't really that persuadable to us. And so when they started the meeting, they started off by describing the rationale for it. They went through all the reasons that they had told us in private. And at that point, they offered up a time for public comment. And so initially I stood up and said, this isn't going to work. We had almost 200 students vote in 2014. We've registered more students to vote since then. You'll have a greater participation rate. And since there's evidence that each election cycle, Hendrix's numbers were going up, you're realistically going to prevent some students from voting. And the immediate rebuttal from them was an argument about how there's actually an early voting location about 5 blocks or so away from campus, but there's no sidewalks. So you actually would have to walk either across people's lawns or in the street of a fairly busy 2-lane road to get to the Faulkner County Library to cast your ballot early. In 2014, we tried busing people over there. I tried personally driving people over there. I remember stopping by my dorm and kind of just stuffing my friends into the car and saying, let's get this over with. And out of almost 200 votes cast by Hendrix students, only about 30 of them came from early voting. And that was what I kept trying to argue with the actual election commission. Students won't vote early. It's inconvenient to go off campus, especially if you've never done it before. You're not sure how long it'll take. Early voting, depending on what time you go, can be very sporadic, and so you don't know if it'll take you half an hour total or even a little longer, including your driving time. And so after arguing all that, they basically looked at me and said, well, if students really cared, they would plan for it. And so after I sat down, Jim Wilchin, the Dean of Students, and then another student of ours, Michelle Stockwell, they both stood up and again insisted, this is important to Hendrix, this is important to the community. We discussed on how if these were going to be polling stations now, where no matter where you were registered in the county, you could vote anywhere, that faculty and staff who were registered could vote at Hendrix, which is of course a big employer for the county, and then of course UCA, which is even a greater employer for the county. And so after a back and forth and probably total arguments and comments for about 12 to 15 minutes, they said, we're going to go on recess. The important thing to note during all this is that for any sort of change, you need the entire 3-person election commission to vote unanimously. And it's broken down based on the partisan makeup of the overall state. And so we had 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, and so you had to get all 3 of them to agree to any sort of change. So during the break, they came up to us, they said, hey, we're going to maybe go for a test run. We're going to vote to let you have your precinct for the primary, which happened this past March, and based on those numbers, we'll then decide from there, do we want to keep your precinct for the actual general election or no? And so we were able to be a little relieved. We had quite a bit of pushing from both the Election Commission and members from the county clerk's office saying, but we need you to get students to volunteer to work the polls on that day, and you really need to show up. And so fast forwarding really quickly then to March, what we saw was we more than doubled our numbers. We had just under 200 votes at Hendrix in 2014. This past March, we had over 500 votes cast on the campus precinct. Even in terms of students volunteering across the county, as opposed to just having students working at Hendrix and UCA's precincts, I would say that we probably had about 15 students across the whole county helping hand out ballots, work the computers, help the rest of the community vote. And it was actually so astounding that they didn't give us many resources in terms of computers to actually check people in. And so we had a line that went almost out of our entire student center, which took 45 minutes because that many people wanted to vote. And so thankfully, going forward to this election, we are going to have one for the general election. It's been really nice though, because a lot of students definitely have paid attention to the fact that this fight came up, students reacted and went to vote in March. And it was really astounding to me today to see not one, but several students post on Facebook today that they went and voted early because they wanted to avoid that line from March, because they know how many people are going to vote at Hendrix. And so it definitely wasn't the experience that we thought we were going to have going in, but we were able to get the outcome that we wanted, and it definitely made a difference to Hendrix.
Right. And Peter is, I think, being not recounting his role in this, he gave a really great speech at that meeting, which really was incredibly persuasive and clearly pushed, I think, at least the Democrat on that election commission to kind of get a little more spine about standing up on that issue. And it was, as Peter says, I think the election commission was caught off guard to have that many people interested. They were used to having their meetings in quiet, kind of doing their thing, and then moving on. This is important, and there's not a tremendous amount of empirical research on it, but there's some that on-campus voting centers matter enormously to student turnout. The things that turn out students to vote are some of the same things that turn out any rank and file voter. It's being contacted by campaigns. It's living in a swing state. It's those kinds of things that matter. There is actually an interesting issue, is that science students are least likely to turn out to vote on campuses, and so we actually have a little disadvantage of being a pre-med school in that regard. But these structural barriers, that is not having access to a polling site, matter enormously, and the empirics on this are really important. The biggest barrier for students is registration, and we'll talk a little bit more about what's been going on at Hendrix and what Peter's been involved with, and others in this room have been involved with on the registration front. And you got to remember that students arrive at college when they're 18. They've never done this in most cases. They've never registered to vote. They've never voted. This is all pretty overwhelming. And any barrier you put in place of a new voter, it's an obstacle that really stymies their participation. But there actually has been some research done on how important just having an on-campus site is. And we've got all kinds of empirical evidence that every block you move a precinct from someone's home, it matters in terms of reducing the vote. And there was actually one study done at a university in Wisconsin where part of the students who lived on the campus could vote on the campus. Other students on that campus actually had to go off campus. And there was a 43% difference between the turnout of the folks who had a precinct on campus and those who had to go a fairly short distance away to vote. So this access really matters, and this location really matters, and having the site on campus is enormously important. But it's not just having access on campus. I think it's a lot of other things that colleges can do and should do to be sure that students have access. So Peter, you want to talk a little bit about registration and some of the other programs that we do to really try to make this less intimidating and more accessible?
So starting my freshman year at Hendrix, I had turned 18, and then 2 weeks later came from Naperville, Illinois, down to Conway, Arkansas. I never registered in my life before. I knew that I was going to be spending the next 4 years here. And so the day I moved into college, my dad and I went to the county courthouse and registered me on campus to vote in Conway. And what was interesting about that is that it was the fall of 2013, so there really wasn't a whole ton of talk yet about the upcoming elections. And I spent a good chunk of my first semester just trying to figure out where I was going. Fast forwarding then to the fall of 2014, I had spent my entire summer here in Conway working with the local Democratic Party with both local campaigns and some of the statewide ones, such as the gubernatorial and senatorial campaigns. And what we really stressed was Hendrix's voter registration numbers, at least according to our database, were really, really low. We were looking at a database saying that there were about 500 students registered, but when you actually took out the students who had graduated but just never changed their registration, you were looking probably closer to less than 200 students registered who were actually still attending Hendrix. And so the first thing that we did was think, what if we just started asking the freshmen to register? You move in anyways, you have a long day where you're getting your mailbox, you're moving into your dorm, and the way that our student center sets up orientation, you already have to go almost through an assembly line to get all of your information, to make sure that you know where you're going. And so we just simply asked the dean of students, can we have a table for students to register? And we weren't sure how many students would register because we thought maybe parents would try to push them out of the way, or maybe students really wouldn't be that interested. But we wound up getting almost 100 forms that day. We got 99. And I remember telling myself if we got 100, it would be really cool, but we only got 99. And what we tried then doing between freshman move-in day and the deadline to register to vote in 2014 was to then go after everyone who wasn't a freshman but still was going to be here on campus and voting. And we had some mild success at first. It was definitely difficult, especially with people who were registered back home and saying, oh, why would I change from Little Rock to Conway? Or especially, why would I change from another state to Conway? Like, I want to vote there. And we weren't able to persuade them all, but we were able to, over the course of the fall of 2014, register just over 250 students to vote who previously had either been registered back home or, for the most part, not registered at all. And we were able to see just under 200 students vote in 2014, which compared to the previous midterm of 2010 was from 72 to about 190. Moving ahead for the following year, even though it wasn't an election, we thought we need to kind of keep this culture going. And so we set up the voter registration table again. That year we got 101, so that was great. And what we kept pushing for then was just year-round voter registration. And so we registered people in the fall of 2015. We were registering people in the spring of 2016 leading up to the election. And what was really important during all of this was keeping track of whether or not these students were still here and making sure that they were aware that it was time to vote. And something that we had discovered in this first year and a half was actually working with the county clerk's office to make sure that the forms were right. If you look at the voter registration form, it says on one of the lines to put your physical address, but on the next line it wants your mailing address. And every Hendrix student would just write their address and then their P.O. box all in one line. The county clerk doesn't accept that. The county clerk will point out on how you don't physically live in the box. And so through trial and error, we actually had to go back and find people which we had tried to register and then say, we're sorry, the box belongs on line 3, not line 2, which was frustrating, but we were able to really get this culture going. But what really mattered, I think, after 2014 especially, was that especially those last few days before the voter registration, we didn't just have tables outside. I was going through dorms, other friends of mine were going through dorms, people were carrying forms in their backpack. It was just, no matter where you were on campus, there was the potential that you could register to vote. And going through for all of 2015, then the way that we approached things this past fall with the voter registration was that exact same method. So while it was really great to try to get freshmen early by registering them on move-in day, to catch everybody else, we were carrying forms around, we were sitting at lunch and dinner for hours at a time, just trying to get 2 or 3 forms every day. And the result of all this is that I have managed to keep track of just how many students are still registered and actually still attend Hendrix. And from that number of 200 when I was a freshman to now when I'm a senior, we're looking somewhere between 920 to 960 students registered on the campus. That's not students who are registered back home. That's a different number, which I'm not 100% sure on. But of a student body of about 1,350 students, almost 1,000 are registered at Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas. There's probably a couple other hundred who are registered, whether elsewhere in Arkansas or in whatever state they're from originally. And it was tough. There were a lot of times of people walking by saying, I don't want to register, people ignoring you. Some of my friends are sitting in the back, and I'm sure that they've seen myself get ignored or even them get ignored. And it's been really different this year compared to the previous 2 years because you don't have as many people walking away. It's not as weird to kind of pause before you're going to dinner to register to vote because you not only know one other person who's registered, it's like half of your friend group or more is registered. And it's been a nice transition to see that because hopefully, even though I won't be here next year, I'm hoping to still see a lot of this excitement, both from the beginning with freshman move-in day, but then even just steadily throughout the semester, getting voter registration forms. Even in off semesters when we didn't have an election coming up, we would still probably get 100 to 120 forms. Students were still interested in doing this because even if nothing was coming up, they remembered all the hoopla from last time. And it definitely has changed over the time I've been here.
Yeah, and it's not only been this cultural change, but it has showed up in the numbers. And there's an outfit out of Tufts University, the National Study of Learning, Voting, and Engagement, which focuses on this issue of campus voting. And in 2014, Hendrix was compared to other private bachelor's institutions, Hendrix had a turnout rate that was 8% higher than those other institutions. And I think we're all eager to see what these efforts have paid off in terms of 2016. Just to kind of move us towards the culmination here, Peter, what would you say, why does this matter? I mean, okay, it's been something you've dedicated a lot of hours to. Why, in a kind of broader sense, normatively, why is student participation worth caring about?
So one of the things that we talk a lot at Hendrix about is this idea of being an engaged citizen, being somebody who's not only interested in learning for the sake of learning, but being able to take what you learned and take it outside and better your community with it. And all through middle school and high school, I found politics interesting. I know that most people didn't. But one of the things that really mattered to me through all that was these issues matter. Even if maybe in the moment they don't matter, they matter down the road. And to get on a college campus and to see students express their viewpoints on all of these issues, but then be prevented from actually voting because they don't know how to register, or they don't know how to get to the polling precinct, or they don't know if they need an ID. These very simple questions for people who deeply care about these issues, but just have never been engaged with somebody who would be willing to talk through these things. It just astounded me. And so it just made sense that people who cared about these things weren't just not voting because they're lazy or because they don't care. It's that they didn't know and nobody asked them. And that's something that I think colleges across the entire United States should be working on, asking students, do you know what you want to do? Do you know how to do this? Because even though it might seem really simple for you and I to think like, okay, you register, you go to this precinct, you might need an ID if it's your first time. This is 18, 19, 20-year-olds who have never done this before. And especially if their parents back home were never talking about these issues, why would we expect them to know anything about it now just because they're in a different environment?
Yeah, and I think in addition to what Peter said, I think that we have to recognize that a lot of habits about engagement really are established pretty early on. And it's important to recognize that college students are 18 or 19 years old when these first elections happen. And we know from all kinds of evidence that, the establishment of those early habits has all kinds of implications for later. Not that some folks won't become voters later on, but those habits, I think, are really important. I think it's also important for college campuses to be vibrant places for student engagement, because I think we've talked often about the town gown divide, the divide of a campus community from the broader community. And I think that if there is an awareness that one's vote really does matter in terms of shaping what that community in which he or she's living, how it does matter. I think that really is important. And so we dedicate not only time to registration, but we also do work with a Know Your Ballot event in which folks who are local elected officials and candidates come to campus, get to know students and vice versa, and really start to build, bring down some of that divide. And I think especially at a place like Hendrix, which is, I think, culturally different than the community around it. I think it's fair to say whatever we can do to begin to erode that division, I think is very, very important. And I think that's another important front. And I think in the most recent school board election, we saw a lot more student engagement in that. And that is obviously a fundamentally important part of governance for a local community. And that was a big payoff. So I think there are those kind of substantive benefits of student engagement in terms of voting, but I think that is just this broader importance from a perspective of democratic theory, is that the celebration of participation in democracy is something that is symbolically just incredibly important. And while there are all kinds of other ways in which to participate in American democracy, from protest to jury duty, there is this thing about the ballot that is so important, and doing what we can to kind of hold that up, to elevate it. It really is one of those times where I get a little preachy about this stuff, is that, this is fundamentally important stuff. It is worth celebrating, and I think college campuses have a particular responsibility to do what they can to elevate this really incredibly sacred act that is the vote. And so I think it's worth doing, and I do hope that other campuses do begin to engage more deeply in this activity. We have seen some campuses around the state that have certainly tried hard to make themselves places where there is access to on-campus voting. Those campuses have a big disadvantage. Peter noted that it has to be unanimous to close a precinct. It also has to be unanimous to open a new precinct. And that is a real barrier. And so if you get it, it's hard to lose if you fight hard, the way that Peter and other folks at Hendrix did, but it's really hard to get access on the front end. And I do think that it is time to maybe think about some more structural changes, legislative changes, to really begin to mandate some of this access, because it is so important to America's democracy, Arkansas's democracy at present, but then moving towards the future. So I think we'll cut it off there, and then turn it into a broader conversation in the 20 or so minutes we've got left.
Well, thank you both. That was very, very informative. And before we open it to questions, I want to ask you this, Peter. What are you hearing? I mean, the millennials, young people, get a pretty bad rap in terms of voter turnout, not just on the college campus, but percentages compared to older voters. And we've spent time in our class studying this percentage. What are you hearing among, and I'm not talking about who they're voting for or what but what are you hearing among your students and the people you're talking to about being excited about participating in this election? Because there's been some discussion that either the negativity of the election and or not the candidate of the young people's choice or in the finalists that would depress turnout. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, so it was really interesting seeing on how Hendrix students evolved from the March primary until October 2016. Bernie Sanders won our precinct overwhelmingly. We had about 500 votes total for the precinct. Bernie Sanders got over 250 of them. And in the initial weeks following the Arkansas primary, there was definitely a lot of chatter among students about, can Bernie Sanders still win? If he doesn't win, am I going to vote for Hillary Clinton, or will I go for a third-party candidate? But what I think really mattered is that even if they weren't sure what they were going to do after the dust had settled, they were still paying attention and really following what was going on. And so what I saw going into the summer with the end of the Democratic primaries and it looking clear that Secretary Clinton was going to be the nominee was a lot of students still following the election, even if their candidate wasn't actually going to be in the general. There were obviously some who really dragged their feet and were being non-committal or saying, I might do it, but I don't really want to. And honestly, the debates, I think, really took anybody who was in that camp and convinced them that they need to go vote this election. We held giant watch parties for all 3 presidential debates, and the first one we had almost 150 students there. The second one we still had about 80, maybe 90, and unfortunately the last one we probably only had about 50. And when I was going around asking people, they said they just were so awful, Peter, I couldn't watch another one. And so while I think students are thrown off and perhaps a few are turned off by the overall negativity of the campaign, I do think that since March you've seen a lot of students keep track of what's going on, even if their candidate of choice isn't still competing. And you've definitely seen them deliberate what's going on, whether it's the debates or any other news story that continues to come out.
Okay, anybody have any questions? Because I've got a couple more. Emily, what's that? Bob's going to bring the microphone to you.
Hi, my name is Emily Kearns. I'm a second-year student here at the Clinton School, and I was wondering if you could talk more about what inspired you to get engaged. You talked about going to the clerk's office with your father that first year. Could you talk more about what inspired you to get there? What was your motivation?
Well, I guess the first time I really found any interest in politics was I was actually on a family vacation, and we looked up on how our Illinois Senator Barack Obama had won the Iowa caucus. And that whole day, my dad was just watching CNN and watching, oh, this is the percent that he got, this is what's going on the Republican side, here's who's dropping out. And I remember my dad just saying over and over again, I can't believe he actually did it. And so all through the rest of the 2008 election, despite being in 7th and 8th grade, I was following every primary. I was trying to figure out what the Senate was. And so by the time I got to college, I just thought, finally, I get to register to vote. I had actually spent a good chunk of 2012 bemoaning the fact I was 17. But just, it caught my eye and I was hooked.
Any other question?
I'll follow up with that. You've dedicated a lot of time to this. What do you see yourself doing with this energy kind of after college, either in terms of your career or in terms of your avocation?
I do think that my specific interest in voter access has definitely evolved over college. I thought voting was important. I really thought it was important to get my friends registered. But I now can't help but just fixate on all the different issues that I see in terms of access to the polls, whether it be voter ID laws, the removal of vital precincts, cutting down voter registration deadlines, or the actual amount of time for early voting. All of these things are issues that I really wasn't familiar with going into college. I just thought you go and vote, and that was the big barrier. People didn't want to. And college has really opened my eyes to all of the obstacles that are, whether intentionally or unintentionally placed, that really disenfranchise thousands of people. And this is something I do want to work on after school.
All right, we've got a question. Graham, right over here. We got one at the back, too.
Thank you. My name's Davis Trice. I'm a senior at the University of Arkansas up in Fayetteville. I'm Director of External Relations with Student Government, and along with Ryan Alonzo, who's my co-director. But we had a big fight, mainly credit to Ryan, to get a voting center on campus this summer, and it failed. So looking forward, we're planning on getting started on another fight early in the spring. But you mentioned more structural, more legislative changes in the state. Is it worth, getting started on efforts like that immediately, or should we just keep trying again with the voting commission, regardless of the party buildup of our county's commission?
Yeah, I think it's worth thinking about. I do think that there is, personally, I think there's tremendous value in staying engaged at the local level. And so in some ways, if there was some legislative change, it might really take away that local energy, because I think there is this important value of students really engaging with their local community, and it goes beyond just getting access to the ballot, but to other issues about what schools look like, what communities look like, who governs those local communities, et cetera. So I do think there's value in that ongoing engagement. I do think it's interesting to think about what could be done more structurally to at least ease things. And we certainly have seen, I think we know there are going to be ongoing battles around voter ID in Arkansas, and there are going to be efforts to place that barrier in the state constitution. College students are going to be front and center in that, or need to be front and center in that, because a big debate is going to be what ID is permissible, right? Does it require a picture ID that is issued by the state, or might a college or university ID be sufficient? So no matter the debate, whether it's at the state level or at the local level, there are all kinds of points of entry. And I think that you guys are working on this. I mean, you got a lot of work to do. We all have a lot of work to do in unison with you, but it's important work. It's really important work. I'd put it at the top in terms of the kinds of projects that you guys could work on.
Well, let's give credit where credit's due, because Davis and those guys at the University of Arkansas and the students there, they made a gallant effort. They followed your model. They mobilized. They had a short period of time to do it. They really made an effort and lost in a partisan vote at the election commission. But you know, when you look at this, and you mentioned the legislative aspect, Jay, and that's interesting. You got the campus at the University of Arkansas, Peter, 27,000 students. That doesn't count the faculty and the staff. 27,000 students, that's larger than most Arkansas towns. And so it's in the top 20. And to, you know, they got a case to be made. And I think maybe the example, Davis, maybe the example you use is when the voter turnout at Hendrix doubles. If they got 1,000 people, how many students you got? 1,300 on the campus?
Yeah.
1,300, and if they got 750 that vote in November, plus those that are voting elsewhere. I mean, that's one of the highest voter percentages around. That's a huge number. So maybe that's a case to be made. So, but I want to be fair that the students at the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville should be commended for the work that they did. They worked hard. Yeah. Yes, sir, right at the back.
Good evening. My name is Kalen Horton. I'm a senior over at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, and I've been working with the Pulaski County Election Commission probably for the last 6 or 7 months to get an early voting poll established at ULR. The thing that stopped us in our tracks literally was we couldn't find an adequate space that met the requirements of the Election Commission in regards to it having to be ADA compliant, access to open, free parking, and all this other type of thing. So it just kind of like put us at a standstill. When securing your space up at Hendrix, did you have a similar issue or anything like that? And if so, how did you overcome it?
Yeah, we don't have the same parking issue that UALR does, but it was a concern. There was some conversation about that because it is a voting center that is open to the entire community, and so we have placed it in a place that is quite accessible. It's literally the most accessible place on campus in terms of ADA and some other ways, and there is parking available nearby that's fairly easy to walk to. So it did come up in the conversation. But was not as big a barrier as at UALR, which I think has more obstacles in that way.
Let me make a case for you. I think, first of all, thank you and congratulations for doing that. You know, go sit down and talk to your very talented and bright athletic director, who's a good guy, and let's use the jack. Use the jack. And clear off that parking for that day and just restrict a whole bunch for voter parking. I early voted today across from the Pulaski County Courthouse, from City Hall, and they had like 5 spaces for early voting. So it's not like you got to take up your whole parking lot. So I'd make an appointment with the athletic director, and I would continue to push, because you do have a good place that's easily accessible, right off of Main Street, and I guarantee you, you can make your case. Now, we'd have to, the athletic director may be watching this, and I may get a hate call tonight, but that won't be my first one, and it won't be my last one when it comes to voting access. But I want to thank you for doing that, because that, I mean, again, UALR deserves credit for making this is a movement that needs to go on, and student voting is a big deal. So that would be my recommendation. Okay.
And
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Skip, if I might, and I know that you guys at the U of A did a good job of talking about, it's not just about students, it's also about the employees. I mean, and these are UALR, U of A, even Hendrix in Conway. I mean, these are mammoth employers. So
Yeah.
it's not just the student bodies. And I did think that was the most, that really did help sway the conversation at Hendrix, especially with helping UCA, which is obviously an even bigger employer, keep their place open. So I think that is a very important part of the argument.
But good for you for trying. Yes, Sochi, right here, and then we'll come to you.
Hi, I'm Xochitl Delgado Solorzano. I'm a second-year student here at the Clinton School, and I'm a Hendrix alum, so I'm very happy to hear that y'all are doing this. I was one of those students that drove 3 hours home to vote, so. But I have two questions, or maybe it's a two-part question. One, since you're a senior, and it sounds like this has been primarily student-led by you, what are you working with infrastructure to keep this going? And then at the same time, Jay, you said that college campuses have a responsibility to inform students and allow them to have the opportunity to do this on campus and to be informed. Is there anything that Hendrix administratively is doing to support the students in doing this and to maintain it?
So one of the things that we've really focused on this year is that we've specifically put together a committee of students to work on all election activities. So this included voter registration, setting up Know Your Ballot event, setting up all the debate watch parties. And we intentionally selected students who won't be graduating this May. And these are students who have been involved in both the Young Democrat and Young Republican chapters on campus. These are students who have been invested at least since last spring, some even earlier. And so our hope is that once the seniors graduate, there's still going to be students there who have been in this model, they've worked with Dr. Barth, and even if maybe they need to find a couple extra hands, there's at least people who have been around the block once and have seen how it works. And of course, Dr. Barth has seen how it all plays out and can give anyone any tips that they need.
Yeah, and I have to really, I wish he could have been here tonight, but Dean Jim Wilchin is fantastic. He's actually taking a day off on election day. He'll be the sheriff of the precinct at Hendrix, and other staff members also taking time off that day. And so it's a real institutional commitment. You know, the first course that students take at Hendrix now, the first semester seminar is a course called the Engaged Citizen, and you know, again, there are all kinds of ways to be engaged citizens, but this is a pretty fundamentally important one. And so I think your point is these efforts have to be sustainable. If they're too student reliant, the institution also has to be bought in and have the kind of people power and infrastructure to sustain it.
Okay, who else had a question? Did you have a question right here? Yeah, there comes a microphone right behind you.
Hello, my name is Ryan Alonso. As Davis said, I'm the Director of Municipal Relations with the Associated Student Government at the University of Arkansas. So first off, I would actually like to thank you guys for your initiative at Hendrix. It's actually what gave me the idea to pursue getting a voting center at the University of Arkansas. But second, like Peter, like this has become, voter registration and student advocacy has become like my passion.
Good.
But I've been doing research, and the Pew Research Center actually has released data saying that students, you know, as you said, are very politically involved and aware. However, millennials tend to express these beliefs in non-traditional ways. So we'll post memes to Facebook, but we won't turn out and vote. How do we overcome this behavioral barrier, so to speak, and how have you done that at Hendrix?
This might at first sound kind of like a weird response, but honestly, the biggest thing that we did was try to make voting not seem lame. And what I mean by that is that, you say, oh, I'm going to go vote, and, there might be a couple people who give you thumbs up and say, that's great. But then you just start saying, oh, do you want to come with? And honestly, one of the things that we did the most of in 2014 and then really perfected going into the primaries was the persistent ask. So not you actually having to drag somebody, but just repeatedly going, hey, have you voted yet? Hey, have you voted yet? Hey, have you voted yet? I'm sure that several of my friends can remember me texting them at all hours of the day asking if they were voting. I'm sure that they've seen me show up to their dorm rooms asking if they voted yet. But instead of it being just one or two people doing that, really getting almost your mini army of students who are willing to kind of go out and just look kind of silly at first, but really just point out that this does matter. Because as it becomes a more normalized process, it doesn't become as weird to ask your friends, are you going to go vote? It's not as weird to ask your friends to register, because even if they then say that they don't want to, you have responses ready that you know have worked. I think that the real barrier that happens for a lot of us is that someone says, oh, I don't want to vote, and then you stutter and say, how could you not want to vote? It's really practicing yourself and other people who care about it to find other ways to persuade people. And the way that I found to be the most compelling is honestly just persistency, because eventually people just start thinking, wow, this really does matter. I'm going to go vote.
Peter, are they interested in local issues and other races beyond the presidency? I mean, do you find students that are engaged in, like the medical marijuana amendment or in the U.S. Senate race? Or, what are you hearing there?
So what we see is a combination of, due to internship opportunities, we do have students who are involved probably at every level of campaign work. So whether running for quorum court or all the way up to the U.S. Senate and presidential races, there are Hendrix students who are involved. And Dr. Barth and the college as a whole does a really great job of helping identify where connections exist within these campaign infrastructures to plug students in a way that can get them college credit. Potentially, you could get a paid internship through a program that we have called Odyssey. Or at the very least, you definitely get that hands-on experience of being engaged in a campaign. The ballot initiatives are a little trickier, because I think that with the exception of the medical marijuana and then potentially the minimum wage, it's been very difficult to persuade college students why these issues matter, because to most college students, they think, I'm here for 4 years and then I'm going to blank, whether that's somewhere else in Arkansas or out of Arkansas. And so I do think that there is a lot of work to be done in terms of engaging people more with each ballot initiative, so that hopefully when we get to November, you don't just see like a split of 50-50 because students didn't know what it meant. But in terms of the overall structure of local to presidential politics, it definitely falls off the more local you get, but there's still students involved at each level.
Yes, at the back right here.
Hi, I was chair of the Faculty Senate at Pulaski Technical College in 2014, and one of the hardest things I did there was convincing people to vote in an off-year election. And I was wondering what you all did, or if you have done anything to educate potential voters to the great importance in voting off-year elections. I mean, these are wonderful initiatives to get polling places on the campuses, and I think they need to go all through the state. But we tend to focus mainly on presidential elections, and I'd like to see more interest in off-year elections, because those are the ones, in many ways, those are even more critical. So I was wondering what y'all did.
Yeah, and I do think that's Peter's early point about, working on this voter registration year in, year out, and not just seeing it as a presidential election year project, but I mean, showing up, and encouraging voter turnout, in a not just an off year but an odd year election, because we know that in fact the greatest barrier to student participation is actually not the voting place on campus. It's really registration, which is very, very difficult, complicated, and requires, of course, several stages. So that's a crucial thing. And then, of course, having the system to activate folks, let them know that it's happening, and having these Know Your Ballot events and other forum in every cycle, and that's just kind of built into our calendar now as an important thing. And sure, our turnout is not as high. It wasn't as high in 2014 as it will be this year because of the presidential election, but it was pretty darn high, I think, because of a combination of folks feeling that the Arkansas elections in 2014 were battleground elections, but then also this sense that access was there and that student participation did matter.
Well, and then really the last thing too, and I'm curious how this will go in 2018 actually is 2014 was our test run to see what voter registration methods work, what works to get people to the polls, and then 2016 was really us having already the ground running and interest because of the presidential election. Obviously, there's a bit more excitement now because there's presidential candidates, there's a lot more media attention, but the people who have been working on it in 2014 with me and the people who are still working on it now have exhibited the same level of excitement. And so now that we kind of know what our methods are to get people to register, the type of events that actually attract students, I'm hoping that if you can still have at least a couple students out there with that same level of excitement, it'll still keep the culture flowing. The numbers will probably drop a little in 2018, but I'm guessing they'll still be higher than 2014.
Indeed.
Peter, to your knowledge, so Hendrix has a voting site, UCA has a voting site. Anybody else do we know of? What's that?
Yeah, Arkansas.
A-State does? Arkansas State has one? Washita?
Baptist. Sorry. I know that the funny thing, well, I have learned a lot about this because of what the battle that took place at the University of Arkansas, but at Washita Baptist, I believe Sarah Huckabee tried to get a voting center, and at the time, the legislature was actually flipped. 2 Democrats sat on the election commission and 1 Republican, and that was also, I guess, a partisan battle for her to do that, and she tried to bring her father into it, but I just find it ironic how, at the University of Arkansas now, that it's flipped again, but I know that happened there, and I know that as the University of Arkansas was going through our, attempt, I know that Arkansas Tech also tried to at least gauge interest in establishing a precinct there, but I guess that goes back to a question, if I can ask one.
Sure.
So Faulkner and Washington counties actually did switch to the Rolodex model, as you said, where voting center precincts don't exist anymore. Do you think that will have an effect? I know it did at the primaries, but what kind of effect are you anticipating that having on overall voter turnout at these collegiate voting centers?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So there are a handful of counties that have moved to these county-wide voting centers. I think it's a very attractive model in a lot of ways, as long as it doesn't reduce the number of sites so dramatically that folks who have transportation issues and who have other obstacles to voting just don't have a place to go. And I am worried that we will see for efficiency that we will shrink the number of sites so much that the elderly and others without easy transportation really will be shut out. So I think that's something to watch and pay attention to in the years ahead. So I think right now what we're seeing in most of these counties is they're keeping the number of sites pretty high, but enhancing the voter center model in a way that probably will be very beneficial to turnout. But I think it is something we need to watch moving forward. And I think we all know, and this is I think a crucially important thing that we've got to work on as a state, is increasing the number of poll workers, because that obviously is so important. I mean, and the poll workers keep getting older and older. I think we all know that, and we've got to, as a state, do those things to activate more poll workers. There is a measure there. It is now possible for high school students who are not yet eligible, I believe, can work the polls now. We need to get a new generation of poll workers into the process. It's really difficult, but it's so important because you got to have people there, even with technology. And you actually have to have technology-savvy people working the precincts now as well. And I do want to give praise to Sarah Huckabee. We students all owe Sarah Huckabee debt because she was involved in the litigation that ensured that students can vote at the place they consider home, whether that is their home or their campus. And I know for most students, they consider their home the college campus for a majority of the year, and I think she's a big important part of that.
Peter, have you read Ari Berman's book, Give Us the Ballot? Dr. Barth can get you a copy of it. It's one of the best books on voting access around. It's a new book, and a recent book about a year ago, and it's really good, and I highly recommend it. Any other questions? Yes, got one more back here.
I would just like to state, I didn't mention earlier that we were talking about the university system. We tend to focus on the university system, and that's all very appropriate, but there are tens of thousands of students in the community college system across the state, and they need to be brought into the conversation. Thanks.
Good point.
I think the great news about this is that we're having the conversation. I think the great news is that Hendrix made its case. The University of Arkansas at Fayetteville made a courageous stand that I think ultimately will prevail. I'm glad to see UALR jumping out there. I think that is a good thing. So we're making the case. And on election night, Peter, we're all going to be watching the precinct at Hendrix College to see how many votes turn out so we can use you as the poster child for college student voting access. Let's thank Peter Butler and Jay Barth very much.